Hello everyone, welcome to URM's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about PCI DSS, so all around the payment card industry data security standard, and in particular version 4, as the deadline is looming. So my name's Lauren Gotting, I'm the new business director here at URM. Today I'm joined by Alistair Stewart, who's one of URM's senior consultants and QSAs, and he'll have a moment to introduce himself properly very shortly. So you can see the agenda there. We're going to talk about the timetable for transition. This has been out for a long time, and we're just going to sort of go over the final bits now, because March is the final deadline. The key new requirements, and we'll also go over some of the smaller requirements as well that may not be as widely published. We'll cover off changes to SAQ, so the self-assessment questionnaires, and we'll allow time for some specific question and answers at the end. But if you do have anything you'd like to ask throughout the session, please just pop it in the box. We'll get to as many as we can at the end, and as ever, if we don't answer your questions live, we'll get back to you after the session. Okay, so before we dive into the specific topic, for those that don't know about URM or are fairly new to us, we've been around for very nearly 20 years. It's 20 years this year, actually. We've got a great team of consultants that are very experienced and very dedicated to working with our clients to help them be more secure and do things in the right way. I think that's what really sets us apart from others. We're not here just to tick a box and move on. You know, we really want to improve security across the board. So we have a team of QSAs, but we also get involved with ISO projects, ISO 27001, 22301, GDPR, and we also have a cyber team as well. So particularly around PCI, you know, we can help with the QSA part, but we can also help with the pen test you may need, the scans you may need as well. So we can offer that all under one roof. And Alistair, if I hand over to you and you can tell everyone a little bit more about your experience.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I've been with URM 6-7 years now. I've been doing PCI QS assessments for longer than I care to remember, but it's definitely over a decade these days. And yeah, we've worked with the version 4 standard since before it was released. We got pre-release copies, and so we've worked with our clients to transition most of them over to version 4 by now. There's still a few hanging on who haven't quite made the leap just yet. And we just wanted to remind everybody of the upcoming deadlines. We just wanted to talk about the fact that these requirements are now, you're going to have to do them, whereas a lot of clients may have been putting off to the last minute.
Brilliant. Cheers, Alistair. And when you say big leap, is it that much of a big leap? You know, are the changes that significant?
A lot of them have been. There was about 45 new requirements in, and some of them did have quite significant technological challenges for a lot of clients to make. Because they relate to e-commerce and websites. Nearly everybody's got a website. Nearly all of our clients take payments via websites, which means nearly all of our clients were affected by the changes. So yeah, the big ones, we started talking to them even pre-release because we got the second draft before it was officially released. Couldn't reveal too much information, but we started prompting our clients in advance on the things that we knew would take a lot of time to get in place.
Brilliant. So it didn't seem like too much of a big leap for most then, because we were out of the gates early.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
Is good.
Yeah.
Excellent. So sorry, let's dive in then, Alistair. Transition timetable. So when exactly then is the deadline for all the new requirements to be in place?
So the deadline I put in was 31st of March 2025 because the new standard was released 31st of March 2023, so 2 years ago. I gave a 2-year period when it was non-mandatory for any requirement that was brand new to the standard. Changed and updated requirements where immediate, any brand new requirements were put under this non-mandatory clause to give people time to meet them, because the council was also aware that some of these requirements will take time to meet, so they didn't want to force it on people from day one.
Yeah, it's quite nice to have a little bit of grace period. People need it, and especially larger organisations. Yeah, excellent. And what does that mean then for organisations' compliance position? What does everything change on the 31st of March? Does stuff stop? What exactly
hopefully
happens?
It'll change before the 31st of March. But in reality, we've had a lot of our clients come to us and say, okay, but my recertification, my reassessment isn't until November, so I need to make sure I got them in by November. And we have to make it clear that's not actually the case. The requirements need to be in place in your organisation by the 31st of March, irrelevant of when your assessment date actually is. So if the requirement is to deploy a new process or to deploy a new system or tool, that system, tool or process has to be running from before the 31st of March. So that when we come back to do your assessment in September, November or whenever it is, we can see evidence that you've been doing that requirement since the 31st of March.
Right. Oh, okay, because it's my understanding that it's a point in time assessment typically every year. So there's no way an organisation can get away with not having something in place by the deadline and then going through the assessment in October. That's not allowed.
No, that simply doesn't happen because the assessment is just looking at a point in time and we're assessing the whole previous year. So when we do that point in time assessment, we're checking, have you been compliant for the whole year since your last assessment? So we look back at evidence across the whole year because some requirements have quarterly, weekly, monthly periodicity type thing that you have to do. And so we will take samples from throughout the year. So we will look back and make sure these requirements have been in place since 31st of March and you've been doing them at the regular required intervals since then. Right. We appreciate it may not be possible, and the council appreciate it may not be possible for you to get requirements in place, especially if you've left it till the last minute and now you're panicking about doing stuff. So there are ways a client can deal with the fact they can't get the requirement in place by the 31st of March. So there's compensating controls, which have been around in the PCI standard since day one, I think, whereby if you can't meet a requirement for a particular reason, then you can do something else instead. So if you can't meet that requirement because you can't get the tool in place, then you can do alternative risk reduction strategies to make sure you can do as much as you can. There's also new customized validations, which is a brand new thing for version 4, whereby if you can't meet a requirement, or if you don't want to meet a requirement because you've got a better way of achieving the same result, you can customize the way you meet a control. So rather than meeting the specific requirement, you can say, well, all these requirements are going to be covered by this new tool we've got that does things in different ways to allow for new technologies or new ideas. So a customized validation could do that.
Okay, and from an assessor's perspective then, say you come around to do an assessment in October and actually they haven't met the requirements since March, they haven't put any compensating controls in or gone above and beyond to show the requirements there, what happens then?
Ultimately, they can't pass the assessment if they haven't done it, and there's nothing to say they have done it. It's the same as them not doing a requirement. They're going to be technically non-compliant. Mm-hmm. What we do in reality is we would then work with that client to put a plan in place of when they can get compliant by, because it might take some time, it might be a relatively quick fix, it just depends. Obviously, they can't go back in time and do what they should have done for the previous 6 months, however long it's been, but we can put processes in place to make sure that going forward it is in place and it is being done. And that plan could then be presented to their acquiring bank to explain why they're currently not compliant when they should be. Yeah,
and that would satisfy third parties in most cases, yeah?
Most banks are happy with a plan to get compliant if you're not, as long as that plan is realistic and you don't just make updates and pretend you're going to get there and do nothing. They just want you to sort of be proactive about getting compliant. In my experience, most banks are quite happy if a client is taking PCI DSS seriously enough and getting compliant, as much as they are happy with a compliant customer. They either is fine for them. They just want to know that you're going to get there.
I've always wondered, Alistair, would banks track plans? So if somebody gave a bank a plan and said, I'm not compliant right now, but here's my 12-month plan, would they keep an eye on that and check back in 6 months and check back in 12 months to make sure they're sticking to it?
Yes, they check back in every 3 months because the banks are required to report the compliance status of all their merchants to the payment card brands every 3 months.
Right.
So they have to submit, a part of their compliance process as a bank is to turn around every 3 months, go to Visa or MasterCard and Amex, say here's all our merchants, these ones are compliant, these ones are not, and these ones are going to be compliant by a certain date, and they would do that every 3 months. So if you are on one of those plans whereby you said to your bank we're going to be compliant by this date, then the person at the bank that you're talking to will be checking back in with you every 3 months to see how much further you've moved along, because it affects their compliance.
Okay, so you can't hide them.
They
are on it.
Yeah.
Oh, right, brilliant. That's really interesting. Thank you very much, Alistair. So basically, 31st of March, everything needs to be in place, and you need to start evidencing it now, no matter when your assessment is.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Alistair, thank you very much. So if we now just move on to look at then, I think some of the key new requirements, are we going to go into any specific requirements here, or are we going to keep it quite high level?
It's worth talking about certainly specific requirements, and I could throw requirement numbers at you, but it's probably not necessarily relevant, but it's more relevant to talk about the actual what the requirements are and what the new ones are and which ones are becoming mandatory in a couple of months.
Okay, I think something you mentioned just a little bit earlier on in the presentation is the requirements that apply to websites. Mm-hmm. Everyone's got a website, so what would be the headline requirements in that space?
Yeah, so there are 3 requirements that are big ticket items that apply to websites that we've been talking to clients about since before it was released, as I mentioned earlier. The first one is regards to payment page scripts. So when you have a web page, lots of web pages now use scripting languages to do various fancy things. So if you've ever had one of those boxes that pops up saying, can we help you, a chatbot type box, that's done via a script because it's a live dynamic thing. And scripts are vulnerable to attack because they're only activated and run when the client accesses that page. So these scripts, when you load the page, these scripts run and do things much like a script in a play. It says you say this, this and this, you do this, this and this at runtime. Scripts are used to do a whole bunch of stuff. They're used to track user activity, they're used to put adverts in, they're used to monitor what somebody's doing, there are all sorts of things they're used for. And because they're active at runtime, they're susceptible to being attacked and changed without the website itself knowing, because it doesn't run the code until it needs to. So a lot of attacks and big ticket attacks and huge attacks that have happened over the past 5 years have been via attacking scripts and changing these scripts. The breach, there was a big breach in the US about 4 or 5 years ago on some big retailers, and it was through one of those chatbot scripts.
So the council will very much make their updates based on where attacks have been.
Yeah, absolutely. The new requirements
are coming from.
If we see huge attacks that follow a new methodology, then absolutely we'll see new requirements come in the next version that deal with that.
Wow.
So that's how they update it. So the scripting one is about making sure that any scripts you do have running on the payment page, that they are authorised to be there. You've justified why they're there. You have a reason for them to exist. Mm-hmm. They've been authorised that they can run, and they've been integrity checked to make sure they haven't been changed at the point they're run. Right. And to do that, you need tools. You need implementations of systems that can actually do that checking for you. And there's a bunch of ways you can do it, from coding languages. There's something called content security policy, which essentially validates where the script code is run from and only allows it to be run from your place, and they can't pull scripts from somewhere else, what they shouldn't do. You've got things like sub-resource integrity, which looks at the integrity of the script before it gets run, but it does that runtime in the browser, and there's a bunch of other ways you can do it. They don't mind how you achieve it, but what they want you to make sure is that when a script runs on that payment page, it is the correct script, and it has a valid reason to be there.
So is this something organisations can outsource? Are there businesses out there that offer this sort of thing as a service, or, as you said, is it a tool? Does it have to be done in-house? I'm just thinking of maybe the smaller organisations, independent shops that have payment pages on websites and things like that. How do they manage this sort of challenge?
It's going to be outsourced. Only the bigger organisations would have development capability inside to do it their own way. Yeah. And in terms of services and products out there, there are plenty of them. They were almost on the market before the standard was dropped, because the companies that run all these sort of security checking programs, security checking services, are on the ball with the new requirements, and therefore will very quickly produce a service to meet these new requirements because they can try it. So you can find plenty of tools that will advertise they meet the new script integrity checking requirements for PCI DSS, so you can run these tools and deploy these tools on your websites. So yeah, it's something that smaller organisations absolutely should outsource to.
Yeah. Okay, we've actually had a question come in around this point there in terms of tooling. Are there any tools you recommend to meet this particular requirement, or any? I suppose have you seen?
There aren't any I recommend, not because there aren't any that I would recommend, but because as a QSA we're technology agnostic. We don't specifically associate with certain companies because we're supposed to be a step above that, and as a business we don't have a relationship with any of these companies. We don't want to be biased. So there are tools out there, and there are plenty of them, and a quick Google search would find you some of them, and I just encourage you to just research on which tool's going to suit you, because there are a variety of them and a variety of costs.
I suppose, yeah, it does depend, doesn't it, on size and complexity. Yep, okay, excellent. One other requirement I've been involved in a lot of conversations with, I don't know if we're going to, excuse me if we cover this later on, but websites and ASV scans. Is there been a change in requirement for websites now to have more ASV scans that wasn't a requirement before version 4?
No, the ASV scans have not changed in terms of when they need to be done and what need to be done on. The only thing that has changed, which we will talk about in the SAQ section, is some of the SAQs that didn't require ASV scans previously now require them.
Right, okay.
So the requirement hasn't changed, but some more organisations will have to do that requirement that didn't do it before.
I'll come back to my questions on that then, because I've been part of quite a few conversations on that recently, Alistair. So, well, I'll come back to that. Thank you. Okay, excellent. And so websites then, obviously quite a few changes there. Another topic I think that's been growing and is getting bigger, around Cyber Essentials Plus as well, is the use of MFA, multi-factor authentication. Mm-hmm. What's changed for version 4? What do people need to be doing?
So MFA came in, it's always been sort of hanging around the periphery of PCI DSS, but it came in a big way in version 4, in that now multi-factor authentication is required for any access into the cardholder data environment. So that's the bit of your scope that actually contains the card data. Any system that handles card data needs to have MFA on it. There are some carve-outs and exceptions for tills, because you don't want to staff member of the shop having to MFA every time they want to take a payment. But anybody who accesses payment systems, payments backends, databases, all that kind of stuff, that now all has to be MFA'd, whereas it was only admins that needed it before. So you're now extending MFA down to more people. Our general advice is everybody uses MFA for any access, whether it's CDE or not, because it's easier to deploy that way. But the standard has expanded it. And on the back of that, they then added new requirements about how secure that MFA system should be. So it should be, you make sure that users can't bypass it, they can't turn it off or find ways around it. It's protected against specific types of attack that they can be vulnerable to. They have included the fact that it specifically should be 2 different factors, not password and password. It should be password and fingerprint, or password and token, so it should be 2 of the factors, not the same factor twice. They've also called out something that NIST call out. So NIST is the American National Institute for Standards and Technology, and PCI DSS often bases their requirements off whatever NIST say. And NIST released some guidance a little while ago that what they call multi-step authentication is not true multi-factor. And all that is when you log in with multi-factor, the system should take both factors before it tells you whether you've succeeded or not. So if you put username and password, and then it goes, please provide your other factor token, and then it goes, these are wrong, you don't know which one was wrong. But if you go username and password and it goes, that's wrong, before it asks you for the token, you know the password is wrong. So it's giving away some extra information to the attacker about what they've got wrong. So that's called multi-step, when you give that information away that you shouldn't do. True multi-factor should ask for all factors and then simply say, that's not right. It shouldn't even tell you whether the username or the password is the wrong thing. It should just say, failed logon. So you give no information.
Right, okay, so it's not just basic MFA then, there's the levels to it.
Yeah, there is levels to it,
to it.
And most systems are true MFA. There's not many multi-step ones out there because it was an early way of doing it. But you do need to be aware that the standard says it cannot be multi-step, it has to be true multi-factor.
Wow, that's really interesting actually. We've actually had a quite an interesting question actually, which I think your opinion will be really valuable on. Will having Cyber Essentials Plus help with multi-factor authentication and meeting that requirement within PCI DSS?
Yeah, absolutely. You just need to be aware when you combine requirements across standards that the scopes are often different. So you might find that PCI scope goes further than Cyber Essentials scope does, and therefore if you're applying multi-factor to the Cyber Essentials scope, you might not be applying it to all of the PCI DSS scope, and vice versa, because some things are in scope of one and not of the other. There'll be an overlap, absolutely. But yeah, it's a case of working out, making sure that the scopes either match up the same or you extend it to where it needs to cover. Yeah,
okay, so if the, just thinking here on that example there, if the Cyber Essentials Plus was, say, the whole organisation, the whole infrastructure, and that included the CDE, that would almost boost up the MFA requirements.
Yeah, absolutely,
Oh, very good, thank you very much, Alistair. Perfect. And then sort of further key new requirements, targeted risk analysis. Can we dive into that as a topic? Because I feel like there's going to be quite a bit to cover here.
Yes, absolutely. So this is a big new thing for version 4, is what they call targeted risk analysis. Essentially, it is a specific risk analysis on a specific thing rather than a broader risk analysis of the business. And the PCI DSS uses it in two forms. The most common form it's going to be in is to justify a given frequency for an activity that needs to be carried out. There's a whole bunch of requirements that give you flexibility in how often you do them. They say that you should review your security awareness training periodically. They say that you should train your staff on the incident response process periodically. They don't tell you how often it should be. It's up to you to determine that.
And is there a right or wrong from an assessor's perspective?
No, but whatever frequency you choose should be justified with a targeted risk analysis. And that's part of the requirement is anytime you have a requirement that says periodically do something, you need to produce a TRA to say we've chosen 6 months because.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so you have to do that for every requirement.
Every requirement
where
that has
you get to
something
make a decision.
periodically, yeah. Some of them you don't. It says do this 12 monthly or 6 monthly,
Yeah.
and then you just do it. But
Yeah.
others say periodically do something. And they have given a template. There's a template TRA that you can fill out, which includes all the details they expect. You don't have to use that template. You can use your own. And the requirement itself, which is 12.3.1, actually details bullet points of what they want in a TRA for that purpose, which is what matches up with the template they've given. But yeah, they need to be done. And those TRAs should be redone annually, every year, to make sure they're still valid annual frequencies.
And is that a hard and fast requirement within the standard?
Yes.
Does that say, right, you
Yeah.
must do your TRAs
Yeah.
annually? I think it's quite sensible, though. I
Yeah.
think it's quite a sensible thing to do because periodically it could be whenever.
It could be whenever,
Yeah.
and when they turn around and say, okay, we do it 6 monthly, well, why 6 monthly? Why?
Yeah.
What is your reasoning behind that 6 monthly? And that is your evidence so that you've thought about 6 monthly, not just picked a number out of the air because it sounds right.
Yeah. And again, when you're doing an assessment, how deep do you dive into these? As an assessor, will you look at a TRA and make certain or get the understanding of why they've chosen? And if it was way out, what would you do then?
So yeah, we will absolutely look at the TRA. We're required to look at it and make sure it meets all the bullet points of what it should cover. And in there, obviously, there should be a justification of the analysis of the threat and the risk. And that analysis should be sensible and reasonable. Now, that's a big word to use, a word that lawyers get rich on, reasonable and sensible. And so obviously there might end up being some discussion between us and the client as to whether their justifications are reasonable.
Yeah.
But I think, ultimately we're all in it to make sure they're compliant and they're secure. So that's the end goal of everybody. And if there's a disagreement on whether it is a reasonable or not, I'm sure we can just talk through it and work out what's a sensible compromise as to what is reasonable. We've been around enough to get the general feel for certain activities and their frequency of what the industry kind of says should be a thing. For example, to pick on something like if you use encryption, then your cryptographic keys should be rotated periodically to make sure that they can't be compromised. And that period varies dependent upon the encryption algorithm and the key. And there are some generally industry accepted standards for whether it's 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. And so we've got to be guided by that. If they're slightly off from that, they say one's not 2 years, we want 3, that's probably fine. They go, instead of 2 years, we're going to go 10, well, that's a big jump. Why is yours 10 when the industry is generally 2?
Yeah. Okay, so it's just sensible conversations I had during the assessment. And how many TRAs need to be done then? How many requirements are there? This might be putting you on the spot for a very specific question, but roughly, if all the requirements apply to an organisation, are we talking 10 TRAs? Are we talking 100?
No, nowhere near 100. There's about, off the top of my head, there's about 6 or 7 of the new requirements that need a TRA to justify them. And I think there's probably a similar number of the old ones that say periodically they now need a TRA. So if you're doing a full standard, probably a dozen or so.
Yeah.
But most organisations won't be doing all the requirements.
No.
Some will be not applicable, and therefore the TRA won't be applicable. Things like a frequency of anti-malware scans. So if your anti-malware system does a regular scan, that would need to be justified that period with a TRA. Most anti-malware systems now are real-time. They don't do actual scan, they do real-time analysis. So that requirement is not applicable because you don't do weekly scans, you do continuous analysis for viruses.
Yeah.
And so therefore that requirement is not applicable. Things like periodic inspections of your card readers and chip and pin readers to make sure they haven't been tampered with. How often do you check them? That should be justified with a TRA, but unless you've got retail outlets with these devices, you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that most clients will be doing half a dozen or so of these.
Yeah. And are they going to be time consuming to
Not particularly.
pull together,
The template is a one-page template
Okay.
with 6 or 7 bullet points on it they want answered. So it's just a question of identifying what the threat is, identifying the risk, and then analysing why your frequency reduces the risk sufficiently, and then detailing how you're going to monitor the risk going forward. So there's a number of steps that need to be detailed, but they're not complex. There is another type of TRA used when you do the customised approach that I mentioned earlier. If you do a customised approach, then you need to do a targeted risk analysis for that customised approach. That's an awful lot more detailed. That's a 3 or 4 page table with lots of detail in it, because what you're essentially saying there is, I'm going to meet this requirement, but I do it my own way. And so you've got to produce a full detailed risk analysis of why your method sufficiently reduces the risk as if it was the original control or multiple controls if you're combining them into one. So that's going to take a lot more to do. And that has to be done significantly in advance for you to be able to detail how you're monitoring the effectiveness of your new control as well.
Right, okay.
So the risk analysis needs to include the monitoring process for its effectiveness as well.
So you need some time to evidence,
Yeah,
essentially.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Okay.
But vast majority of clients are not going to be doing customized validations. They're only for hyper-specific, unique situations.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any clients that
Not
have
yet,
customised
no,
validations?
no. I've got a couple of clients who are thinking about using them because they're looking at adopting sort of cutting-edge technologies to deal with stuff, and that doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
But yeah, you need to be very risk mature, you need to be very PCI DSS mature, and it takes a lot of time and effort, and so there's a lot of resources involved. So smaller organisations aren't really going to be using them. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I suppose this is for organisations that live and breathe PCI
Yeah.
DSS. It's wholly important to them.
Yeah, or, huge global organisations have lots of different departments handling different stuff.
Yeah.
Might end up with these kind of things.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Alistair. So they're the bigger, should we say, the larger requirements, and there does have some like some large ones in there, especially the TRA stuff. Absolutely. Obviously, there have been quite a few changes. There's probably a lot of smaller requirements that people may overlook. So we can dive into those now. So I understand there's some requirements around encryption of card data that maybe appear quite complicated. Is it complicated? Can you elaborate more on that particular requirement?
Yeah, so encryption is always complicated, even for us. Fortunately, the new encryption requirements won't apply to a lot of organisations because they only apply if you store card data. And we encourage our clients not to store card data as much as possible, because if you don't store card data, then something like 2 out of the 12 high-level requirements completely disappear because they're all related to storage card data. If you go one step further and outsource all the processing of card data to third-party payment providers, then something like 30-35% of the requirements become not applicable straight away without even looking at them. So we always encourage clients not to. But if you do, there are a whole bunch of more detailed requirements to improve the encryption strengths and to improve the encryption of stored data. Historically, what they call sensitive authentication data, which is if you think about your credit or debit card, sensitive authentication data is the PIN number or the CVV2 on the back. It's the sensitive bit that's designed to authenticate the actual card transaction with. That's separate from cardholder data because the standard says you're not allowed to store that full stop. You can store the card number, you can store the name, but you can't store a PIN number, for example.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's obvious why you wouldn't want to do that. But you often do store the PIN or the CVV before you authorise the transaction in case the transaction doesn't go through properly, the system falls over. So when you put your PIN in, the system obviously sends all that off to the bank and says, I need to authorise the transaction. If something falls over with that connection, the system will keep the PIN and retry that transaction several times to try and get through in case the internet connection drops and that kind of stuff.
All whilst I'm just standing in a
Yes.
shop waiting to get my...
Absolutely, yeah. Waiting to get your product. You put the PIN in and it sits there and it sends it off and validates it. And if the internet connection drops or it can't get a connection, it will resend 4 or 5 times before it then gives up and times out.
Right, okay.
So the system will store your PIN so you don't have to keep putting it in every time it retries because that's annoying. And the same with the website. You put your CVV2 in, you push go and it tries to contact and it sits there and waits. And if it has to resend several times, it will store that information. So storing prior to authorization is allowed. But there were never any requirements specifically stating you should encrypt it while you're doing that. It was always considered that you should, because that was sensible, But now they've brought in specific requirements saying if you've got a system that is storing this data prior to authorization, it should be subject to the same level of encryption as any other card data. And yeah, we
That
always
doesn't seem like a small change though to me.
it doesn't, and it won't really affect merchants unless you're designing your own till systems and your own stuff that transmits it. Most of this will be handled by the actual card reader, the person who supplies the card reader for you. But if you're designing your own back-end website systems that move the data around, then this becomes relevant.
So that applies to, in terms of more developers then? Is
Yes.
it software developers?
Yeah, because they'll be looking at the encryption standards used inside the software that's handling this data. There are also new requirements around so if you do store card details and you do store the actual card number and the cardholder data, then they've upped the requirements to do with things like hashing. They've said you now need to use keyed hashes, which are more secure. They've now said that if you're using disk level encryption, so rather than encrypting individual files, you're encrypting the whole hard disk or the whole computer, then you can only do that for removable media, USB drives and stuff. You need to actually have full detailed file level encryption underneath your disk level encryption. So they've just upped the encryption requirements a little bit more than what they were before to protect that stored data, because that's obviously what the attackers are after.
And has this come off the back of attacks as well, like the website one? Is this?
Yes. Historically, most data that's stolen, card data that's stolen, is stolen when it's at rest. Because that's the easiest thing to do, is to just take a database and lift it out and then try and decrypt it later. The attacks on websites have started to steal it in transit. So they compromise the script so that when the customer types their card detail and pushes enter, that's when it gets stolen. That's why those attacks were so successful, is because it's very rare for card data to be stolen in transit. It's easier for an attacker to just lift a whole database of card information out when somebody hasn't protected it properly. And so in order to make sure that when they do get this database, when you see these big press releases about they've lost millions of customer records in an attack and card details was in it, you want to make sure that what they get is useless to them. The card information is only in an encrypted format and cannot possibly be decrypted by them, so you don't lose it. So they're just making sure to shore up that encryption status, and they do regularly update the encryption strength as NIST turn around and say we need stronger algorithms. PCI DSS says we need stronger algorithms, so they follow the industry on that kind of thing.
As a consumer, it makes me very happy that these things are in place. And pre-URM, before I joined URM, I was new to the industry, and you don't, as a consumer that's not in the industry, you don't realise actually the stuff that goes on, you know, behind the scenes that actually makes our lives a lot more secure.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite scary, really.
There is a curse to it, because now whenever I go into a shop and I use a card reader, I look at the make and model and make sure I recognise it before I touch my card to it.
Have you ever not purchased anything because of it? Or?
No, because most of them use the big name card readers. It's smaller stuff is rare to come across. But yeah, I do find myself going, oh, I know that one, it's fine, before I put my card on it.
Brilliant.
Curse of knowledge.
Alistair, and another new requirement, there was some reference to application and system accounts. Can you elaborate for us a little bit more on this particular requirement, please? Yes,
so there's actually about 5 or 6 requirements related to application and system accounts, because they were never mentioned at all before in PCI DSS.
Oh, so they're all new? They're all new?
It's all brand new. I mean, they've always been around, but there was never any requirements related to them. And they are essentially, rather than a user logging onto a system, software often logs onto systems to do stuff. So if you've got software accessing a database, it needs to have a username and a password or some kind of account to access that database with. And that account is used by the system. So it's a system account or an application. It's sometimes called service accounts. The standard calls them application and system accounts because PCI Council like to use alternative terms to the industry standard for some inexplicable reason. So you might know them as service accounts. And essentially there's nothing fanciful in the new requirements. They're all logical things to do, but they include making sure that the account only has the least privileges required to do whatever it needs to do.
Right, yep. Mm-hmm.
They ensure that the account is limited to only be used by the applications and services that need it. They should be reviewed periodically, TRA required.
Very good.
As to whether they need to be changed or whether they need to be updated. They should have sufficiently complex passwords. They don't say how complex. They leave that up to the developers and system administrators to determine what is sufficiently complex. They shouldn't be hard-coded, so the password shouldn't be hard-coded into the application. because then you can just find the password by looking at it in the application. You need to disable what they call interactive logon. So interactive logon is where a user could find the password for the system account and then log on as that system. So they could type the username in and type the password in and log on. So a person could use the system account. That should be blocked. That's not possible in all cases for technological reasons, or you may have another reason why you need to have that account to be able to be logged on by a person. And so if you do, there's a whole bunch of detailed requirements about making sure that that interactive use is justified, logged, tracked, approved, limited and time limited, and a whole bunch of other stuff to make sure that when somebody is using that account other than it's intended, that you can track, trace and work out why and what's going on with all that, so that it doesn't become a security issue. Generally you should disable that interactive logon, but they appreciate that that's not always possible.
Okay. So quite a lot of vigilance then around these requirements.
Yeah. And it all needs to be documented as well. So you'll need to make sure that you document these accounts that exist and what they exist for and why they exist and what systems are using them.
What does that document look like? Is that an Excel spreadsheet? Is that a policy document?
QSA answer is it depends.
Okay.
My personal view on documentation is that it should be useful to the business. That document looks like whatever it needs to look like to make it a useful document to you. If that is a spreadsheet, use a spreadsheet. For accounts like this, it may be a case of some kind of password manager, like LastPass and all the rest of it, that stores them all in a secure vault. It may be that it just simply looks like another group within your Active Directory. So it's inside the system where you administer the access those accounts have. It lists all the accounts that are system accounts rather than standard user accounts in a separate directory on there. And then it's got the name for each one and what it can access. Right. So it could be within the very system that they're configured in. It could be in a separate spreadsheet. It could be in a password vault. Whatever works for your business to be able to monitor and control and review those accounts.
I think that just highlights your pragmatism when it comes to things like this and getting the standard to work for the organisation rather than reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, I don't see a point in them creating a document just for the purposes of a PCI assessment, because then it's going to be looked at once a year and forgotten for the other 12 months.
Yeah, make it useful. No, that's a very good point. Thanks, Alistair. Excellent. Okay, and then other smaller requirements. Are there any? Do you think is worth talking about, worth raising?
Yeah, there's quite a few of the smaller ones that have probably got forgotten about because they're fairly simplistic to do, and people go, I won't bother doing them, I'll look at them. There's a whole bunch of requirements that include annual or biannual reviews. So one of them is you need to review your user privileges every 6 months. So you need to go through every 6 months, look at the user accounts you've got that are in scope of PCI DSS, what access they have, is it still appropriate for that account?
So this might be a silly question, but how do people evidence that?
Yeah, it's a tough one because they go, well, I've looked at it. Do we believe you? Just say you've looked at it and done it. So there's a couple of ways clients typically have done this. One is a recurring Outlook calendar event.
Okay.
That they get that pops up on somebody's diary. So it pops up saying today's the review day. You go and review this stuff, and you put notes into that event. Say I've reviewed so and so. Another one clients do is you use your IT ticketing system to raise an automatic ticket to send to somebody on a particular date saying please do this, and then they put the notes of what they did into that ticket. So that you can somebody physically has to type so that yes, I did this review. If there's any changes that come out of that review, i.e. they need to change the privileges, then that should result in a change ticket anyway, so that should be obvious if there's actual changes made. But if there's no changes made, it just needs to be noting down I did this. And while yes, somebody could lie and say they did it when they didn't, that's not really a PCI DSS compliance issue, that's a HR training issue of somebody not doing their job properly.
Integrity issue, isn't it?
Exactly,
Yeah.
And that PCI DSS can't concern us, but you can tell people to do their job and you can put the process in place to allow them to do their job, and that's what PCI DSS requires you to do. Whether they do their job or not is up to you as a business to monitor as part of how you run your business. And if your staff are lying about what they're doing, that's not something as an audit assessor I can address or even find out, to be fair. It's not something I could necessarily know. Yeah.
And again, I suppose for organisations where PCI is so integral to the business, why would they not do it? You know, like you love PCI, you're a QSA, and you'd like to think clients are in the same boat. If they're managing PCI and compliance, they have a passion for it, you know?
You'd like to think that the PCI has benefits of increasing your security stature as a business, just in general, rather than just being a tick box exercise. It's a useful thing to have because it makes you more secure in some areas. So you'd hope that your staff take it as seriously as the business does, but depends on the business, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. So that was reviewing user privileges. Any other requirements?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of other reviews. They've introduced 12 monthly reviews for hardware and software technologies. So if you use hardware and software, as everybody does, you should review it once a year to make sure that it's still doing what it should be doing. So if, for example, you take on one of those new script integrity checking tools we were talking about earlier, you want to review that tool every 12 months to make sure it's still capable of meeting the requirements, and also to make sure that it's still going to be supported by the vendor. It's not going end of life, or they're not giving up on it and changing to something new. So if it is going end of life, you can then have a plan in place to change it or do something new by the time it becomes end of life. And the same with hardware. Versions of Windows go end of life. You need to make sure that you're not running on older versions of Windows that are no longer supported, or Android or mobile phones are no longer supported, whatever it is that's in scope. So that's a 12 monthly review, as well as any of your encryption algorithms. So we talked about encryption getting stronger, and then NIST saying the encryption algorithm need to be upped, or the key lengths need to be upped. Your 12 monthly review should look at that and make sure that you don't need to move to a new encryption standard because it's being retired.
And so just to confirm with that then, so when we talk about that requirement, hardware, software, encryption methods, that is just for stuff in scope, right? Because I can imagine it could be very timely for large organisations to do that annually.
Most large organisations are probably already doing that annually anyway. They review their suppliers annually to make sure that they're still suitable. They review hardware platforms and refresh them on a regular basis. Most large organisations would probably already do this across the organisation. It's the smaller ones that don't tend to do it, ironically, because they've only got a couple of pieces of software and they use all Windows-based laptops, so why would they review? And that's when things get forgotten or fall through the cracks. It ties in with the fact there's a new requirement to make sure that you have an inventory of all software in scope, whether it's bespoke, custom or off-the-shelf software, because software is considered a system component, much like a laptop or a desktop is, and so you want to make sure that software is supported. So how can you know what software to review if you haven't got a list of what you have?
Yeah. Okay.
So tying in with the new requirement about inventorying your software as a component, you've then got reviewing it every 12 months to make sure it's still relevant to what it's doing.
Okay. And it is all about visibility though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that security does just fall back onto that, isn't it? You need to know what you've got before it's secure and up to date and stuff. Yeah, brilliant.
There's another one to review 12 monthly is the PCI DSS scope. Now, traditionally, when I come in to do a full assessment, the scope gets reviewed at that point by the assessor. What happens is I detail the scope, and if things have changed, I adjust the scope and everything else. And that's not what should happen. Realistically, when I'm doing assessment, I shouldn't be reviewing the scope. I should be looking at the scope and then either saying I agree with it or not. I shouldn't be doing their scope review as part of the assessment. And what they've done is they've said, okay, this shouldn't be done at the assessment point. This should be done before the assessor comes in. So they've put in a requirement that every 12 months, or if you're a service provider, it's every 6 months, but most people it's every 12 months, you should sit down and go over your PCI DSS scope and documentation and review it to make sure it's still accurate. Make sure you haven't added anything to scope that got missed. Make sure your diagrams got updated when you added the new servers. Make sure if you purchased another business or acquired another business, that's been included in your scope as it needed to be. All that kind of stuff has been checked, and your documentation and scoping details have been updated accordingly, so that when I come in to do the assessment, you can go, here's our scope, here's our documentation. I can look it over and go, great, we now know what we're talking about, and then we can move on and do the assessment without having to dig into details of, well, are you sure this works, or have you checked this, and all the rest of it.
And what happens if that hasn't been done? And is there a way to know that that hasn't been done?
Well, yeah, because the document, so the scope review should produce outputs from it to say, we've reviewed this, we've looked at this, we've updated the diagram. So there should be some kind of output from that review process. Again, it could be a ticket, it could be a calendar invite, etc. And it will become obvious if you haven't done it normally, because we'll start doing the assessment and then we'll go, right, we need to sample the servers, and they give us a list of servers that doesn't match up with their asset inventory or with their network diagram. And you go, well, hang on, where's this server on the diagram? And you go, well, it isn't. Well, then the diagram's wrong. Or this is wrong, one of them is wrong, and clearly you haven't reviewed it. So then it will normally get reviewed at that point in the assessment, and they'll update it and all the rest of it. And so it will get done at the point, but it should realistically be done before the assessment comes along, so that you as a business understand the scope that's being assessed.
That makes sense. It'll come out eventually.
Yeah.
And any other requirements worth mentioning?
Password length has gone up from 7 to 12 characters, but I think everybody knew that because that was one of the ones we started banging the drum about early on, because changing password lengths is a contentious issue with a lot of businesses. So they went from 7 to 12 characters, which most businesses I think have done. There's a requirement that was only for service providers has now been shifted to all businesses, which quite often happens. They introduce it to service providers first and then spread it out, and that's to do with detection and what they call failures of critical security controls. So this is whereby your antivirus stops working, or you've got your logging and monitoring and security alerting system stop sending out alerts. The question is, would you know about the fact that it stopped? If your security alerting system isn't sending out alerts, do you think it's because it stopped working, or do you think it's because it's got no alerts to send? You don't know. So you need to have a system in place to detect when it is the fact that it stopped working rather than it's just no alerts to send out. And you need a way of detecting that for anything that's a critical security control, and then alerting on it, and then addressing why it happened and following up on that failure and correcting it so it doesn't happen again. Because some systems, if your firewall stops working, you're going to know about it because nobody can get anywhere or do anything. But if a particular server, the anti-malware solution on that server is not active, how would you know? The fact that it isn't sending out alerts for detecting malware doesn't mean it's not working. It could mean it's not actually detected any malware, which is what you hope, that it hasn't done anything, it hasn't detected any malware. So you need to have these systems in place to monitor these solutions to make sure they're continuously working, and then detect, alert, and follow up on them.
So is that like a system on a system now?
Kind of. I mean, with anti-malware, it's relatively easy because the central control system for anti-malware solutions checks to see how often each device reports into it, because it needs to report in to get the latest updates. And if a device hasn't reported into the central control in a certain period of time, it flags up an alert.
Right.
So it's relatively easy to do with some of the systems, but some more obscure systems might be more difficult to implement. And it also doesn't say specifically what a critical security control is. That's up to you to define what you consider to be critical security. There's a list of examples in the requirement, like firewalls, anti-malware, access control, a bunch of other stuff, but you might have things that are not on that list that you consider to be critical that should sit inside this process. So there's a bit of work to do around what's a critical security control, how do we detect when it fails, and then what do we do to follow up on that failure.
Conscious of time, but that seems like that could be a big one.
Could be. Yeah. It depends on the organisation and technological levels and systems you've got in place. But yeah, there could be quite a bit.
Yeah. Brilliant. And any others before we move on to the SAQ changes, or the top ones for you? The
only other one I think of is that if you're doing your own internal vulnerability scanning, they now need to be authenticated scans.
Okay.
And I mean, if you're outsourcing it to a pen testing company like us, then it will be. Because they're professional testers, they know what they're doing. But if you're doing it internally with your own team, just make sure that your internal testing team are aware that the internal scans now have to be authenticated scans, whereas before they could be unauthenticated. So it's a different type of scan.
Okay. And that does seem like quite a small key change. So
yeah,
very good. Excellent, Alistair. Thank you very much for that. I think that was really useful. So we would just dive in now to the last section of the presentation, and this is all going to be around the changes to the SAQ. So a lot of organisations complete a self-assessment questionnaire. That's how they demonstrate their compliance. There have been some changes. So for merchants, what do they need to look out for when they're completing SAQs?
I would go over the requirements in them. Nearly all of them have had changes, requirements added or taken away. Some have been taken away because they're not relevant. Some have been added. So we mentioned earlier about ASV scans being added to the SAQ. So traditionally SAQ-A, which is the smallest, didn't have a requirement to do ASV scans. And now it has. They've added ASV scanning onto SAQ-A, so even the smallest merchants now need to do ASV scans on their websites.
Now, the burning question I've had with a lot of clients around this is what do they need to scan? What's in scope for the ASV scan for SAQ-A?
So it would be the public-facing IP or IP addresses of your website, because SAQ-A is in relation to websites and taking payments via an e-commerce platform.
Yep.
So wherever your website sits, the payment page is what needs to be scanned. Now, normally you'll have a single pair of IPs for the whole website, so that's what you'll scan. Potentially, you could have the payment page hosted on a different web server to the main web page, depending on how it's structured for larger pages. And so you might only need to scan one of the servers, but they're probably all on the same public IP anyway. So it's wherever the public-facing IP address of that website is, that's what needs to be scanned.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Alistair, because that's, it's come up a few times.
Yes,
so I appreciate you confirming that.
What they haven't changed is the eligibility requirements. So whichever SAQ you were eligible before, you're eligible for the same one. They haven't changed which SAQ fits which solution. So that won't change. You'll still be doing it. They have changed some definitions on the SAQ-A and AEP because they actually include requirements that refer to the cardholder data environment, but the eligibility requirements mean you can't have a cardholder data environment if you have a cardholder data environment, then you automatically default to SAQ-D. So those requirements were generally not applicable because if you fit that SAQ, you shouldn't have cardholder data. But they wanted those requirements to apply to those organizations because they want them to be more secure. So they've turned around and said for these SAQs, any requirements that refer to cardholder data environment are applicable to your website, even though it doesn't have card data in it. It gets a little confusing and they've muddied the waters a lot. I wish they did it a different way, but that's the way they've chosen to do it. So if you are doing A and AEP and a requirement says cardholder data environment, it means your website.
Right, okay. Okay, so it's just change of wording.
It's a confusing way of doing
Yeah.
it, yes, but that's what they've done.
Right, okay. Excellent. And have there been any new SAQs released?
There's been one that was released actually quite a while after the standard was released called SPOC, which is Software-Based Pin Entry on COTS, which is an acronyms within acronyms. Essentially, this is where you've got you might see it in like taxis and market stalls where they've got a card reader device that links to their mobile phone.
Yes.
And their mobile phone is their own personal mobile phone.
Yep.
This is to apply to that solution. So there are solutions validated out there to be able to work on any mobile device, irrelevant of what the device is, without bringing the device into scope. And so these solutions are designed for that type of setup, so they can just deploy it on their own personal mobile. And there's a new SAQ related specifically to requirements for that type of setting.
And that SAQ though would apply to the organisation giving out the hardware and providing the hardware and software, not the merchant themselves.
No, it applies to the merchant that's using them.
Oh.
So the actual hardware and software, the SPOC solution, has to be validated separately. And if you're going to do this SAQ, the solution you use has to be a validated SPOC solution. So you'd need to go onto the council's website and check that your solution is on their list of validated SBOC solutions.
Right, but what are the chances? I think a perfect example there of a market trader, what are the chances of them knowing about this and actually completing an SAQ?
Probably very slim.
Yeah.
Probably very slim. But it is there to cope with that solution where they do need to. I mean, it's up to the banks to tell them they need to be compliant because it's part of the bank's onboarding process. It should be, you need to be PCI DSS compliant and this is what you need to do. But often that doesn't happen.
Yeah, risk-based, isn't it? I suppose the banks, based on risk. Oh, that's really interesting. Brilliant, thanks, Alistair. And SAQ changes, SAQ-D for service providers?
Yeah, this one got beefed up. The original plan was to get service providers to complete a ROC on their own, which was madness. If you've seen a ROC, you'd know it would be madness. So what they decided to do was basically beef up the SAQ for service providers so it provides an awful lot more detail on what exactly is in scope and what exactly has been validated. Each requirement now has an explanation box, so the service provider has to put in why you chose not applicable or why you chose in place. So they have to detail it rather than just ticking boxes, because they've traditionally had problems with confusion over whether a service provider is compliant for the right things or not. So they beefed it up and made it a lot more detailed to make sure that it's clear to the merchant when they get this SAQ from a service provider exactly what the service provider is compliant for and exactly what is being done and what's left for them to cover off.
Okay, so that in your opinion, that has provided clarity. Has that been a good change, yeah? Yeah. Excellent. Brilliant, excellent. Alistair, thank you very much. We've had a few questions come in, so I think that's the end of the presentation itself, but we have had a few questions come in, so we can run through, we'll see how many we get through. Mm-hmm. So first one here, if the requirements are done by a third party, how would they check that they're in place?
Ironically, you shouldn't need to. If you've got a service provider that's compliant, they provide you with an AOC, you should simply get the next AOC the following year to prove they're compliant. But you might want to check in with your service provider and say, are you going to have these new requirements in place in time for end of March, just in case they're not? Because if they're not planning on doing the requirements, then you'll need to do them. So you'd hope that they'd take them up if it's related to their service and they'd do them, but they might turn around and say, no, we're not going to do it, you need to do it yourself, because they might not be able to do it and stuff. So it's worth checking with them and saying, are you going to be doing script integrity checking for us on our website, that kind of stuff, if they're running their website for you. Other than getting a surprise when you get the new AOC and find it doesn't cover it, and then suddenly you go, well, actually now how do we do it? So it's probably worth just checking in.
Yeah, just having those conversations, probably sooner rather than later now, given that we're a few months out. Yeah. Excellent, thank you very much. Hopefully that helped. I've got another question here. Do all of the requirements need to be in place across all payment channels?
Short answer, yes.
Yeah.
If the requirement is applicable to a channel, then it needs to be in place by 31st of March for that channel.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. That one was fairly easy one. Not the usual. It depends. So that's good. And I think we've probably got time just for one more. Which one? Okay. So, how do I evidence I've met the requirements in place by the deadline?
It depends. Well, it depends on the requirement. The simplest place to look is to look at the SAQ or the ROC, because in there are detailed. In the ROC it has reporting guidelines, in the SAQ it has expected testing, and that tells you what you're expected to test to prove that requirement is in place. So that's what the evidence is that you should produce, whether that's checking security configurations, whether it's checking ticket outputs, whether it's reviewing a process or reviewing a document. It'll be in the testing column of you should do this, this and this to check this requirement. So look there and that'll tell you what evidence you need.
Brilliant. Perfect, thank you. Hopefully that helped. And as I said, any other questions that we haven't got round to, we will reach out and pick those up offline. Alistair, firstly, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy diary to come and run this session with me. I'm sure everyone's found it really useful, and you've answered the questions really well there, so really appreciate that. In terms of how URM can support you as an organisation, so we've got two sort of offers on the back of the presentation here. So we're offering half-day version 4 transition planning workshops. So suitable for those that maybe are fresh to version 4, need a bit of guidance in maybe what they've done or what they're planning to do over the next 12 months. And also, obviously, we've touched on the targeted risk analysis, which is a new requirement of version 4. So also, if you'd like some more information and some dedicated time with a QSA to run through what that looks like for your organisation, then that is also something we can support with. As well, being a QSA organisation, if you are having annual rocks or if you're looking at your scope, naturally we can also help out with those activities as well. If there's any interest, please pop it on your feedback form and one of the team will get in touch to organise sort of any other follow-up calls that we may need to do. Okay, so looking into the future at URM's next events. On the 26th of February, we're going to be running an ISO 27001 internal auditing webinar. So we're going to concentrate on how to plan an audit program, what the scope should be, how to document the audits, to really sort of drive, I suppose, internal processes and improvements moving forward within the organisation. And then following that, we've got quite a busy schedule in March. We're looking back at SOC 2 audits. So we've seen a lot of inquiries from clients, new clients, existing clients that are looking at SOC 2. So we thought we'd cover what does an audit look like, how to achieve a successful outcome. So there should be some very useful information during that session. And on the 30th of April, business continuity exercising. So again, something we're hearing a lot of from our client base. So I thought, right, let's put on a webinar on how to actually develop and deliver. I think the key word there is an effective business continuity exercise. It's something we do a lot of, so there should be some really useful information to get from that session. Thank you very much for joining. Please do complete your feedback forms. We like to improve and tweak our sessions based on your feedback, so please, if you wouldn't mind just taking sort of 30 seconds to complete that at the end of the presentation, I'd be very grateful. And thank you very much for taking the time today and spending it with us. Have a great rest of the day.